The storm began long before Elias Ward understood he was falling. The shuttle shook like a wounded animal in the sky as alarm screamed through the cockpit, red lights flashing against his face while smoke curled from the panels. He gripped the controls tightly even though he knew they were useless now, and for a moment he whispered a quiet prayer that someone somewhere would notice he was missing. The shuttle dropped toward the alien moon with a violent pull, tearing through clouds of blue mist until the ground rose fast beneath him. The impact came with a roar that stole his breath and threw him across the cabin, as metal screamed in pain. When the silence returned, it felt heavier than the crash itself. A silence that carried the cold truth that he might be completely alone on a world that didn't want him here. He pushed himself up slowly, every muscle aching, his uniform torn and smeared with dust. The shattered cockpit opened to a world glowing in strange, soft light. Huge crystal pillars rose from the ground like frozen lightning. The sky shimmered with violet clouds floating low enough to touch. Elias stepped out on shaky legs and felt a sharp sting in his ribs, but he forced himself onward. He needed shelter. He needed to survive until someone found him. Footsteps dragged through the shimmering sand as he searched for anything that looked safe. The air tasted sweet but unfamiliar, and every sound echoed like the planet itself was listening to him breathe. A soft hum drifted through the wind, distant yet clear, almost like a voice calling his name even though he knew that was impossible. He followed the sound because the silence around him felt too large to face alone. The humming grew stronger as he approached a large stone arch that pulsed with faint blue symbols. The ground beneath it glowed with every step he took. Elias hesitated because something inside him whispered that this was sacred, a place meant for someone important, not for a lost human soldier who had crashed by accident. But he could barely stand, and the strange warmth coming from inside pulled him in like a promise of safety. He crossed the threshold and the air inside shifted instantly, warmer, softer, almost alive. The chamber stretched wide and luminous, its walls covered in layers of silver markings that flowed like liquid light. At its center stood a figure who made Elias freeze where he stood. A woman, her back turned to him, her violet skin glowing softly under the floating lanterns of crystal, silver hair cascading like flowing starlight down her shoulders. She wasn't wearing any armor or royal clothing, nothing that could hide the smooth patterns running across her skin like rivers of energy. Her posture was calm, graceful, almost ethereal. Elias realized too late he had stepped into something sacred, something forbidden. He tried to move back, tried to breathe quietly, but his boots scraped against the glowing floor. She turned, her eyes widened with shock, bright lavender irises glowing like galaxies. Her lips parted in a sharp breath. Elias lifted his hands in panic and tried to explain, but his voice stumbled out as nothing but a broken whisper. Before a single word escaped him, she screamed. The sound was not loud but deep, like a bell shaking the walls. Crystal lights flickered, the air thickened. Heavy footsteps thundered from the shadows behind the chamber as armed alien guards burst into the room. Tall figures with silver armor and bladed staffs pointed directly at his chest. Elias raised his hands higher, trembling, trying to show he meant no harm. But their expressions told him it didn't matter. He had broken a law he didn't even understand. The woman stepped back, clutching a glowing cloth to her chest as she stared at him with a mix of fear and disbelief. She whispered something in her language, her voice shaking. The guards grabbed Elias with brutal force, slamming him to the glowing floor and binding his wrists with energy bands that burned against his skin. He struggled for breath as one of the guards pressed a weapon to his neck. The woman's voice cracked as she spoke again, louder this time, her hands shaking. The guards hesitated for a moment, but then dragged Elias across the floor, pulling him out of the sacred chamber into a long corridor lit by floating lights. Every step felt like a cold reminder that his crash wasn't the worst thing that would happen today. He looked back over his shoulder and saw the woman watching with wide, frightened eyes, her silver hair trembling as she whispered something he couldn't hear. Her gaze held something that wasn't anger, something closer to fear for him rather than fear of him. Then the doors slammed shut, cutting her from view as the guards threw him into a dark cell and sealed it with a flare of blue fire. Elias collapsed on the stone floor, his ribs screaming with pain, his wrists burning from the restraints. Confusion swirling through his mind as he listened to distant voices echoing through the halls. Words he couldn't understand, but tones filled with urgency. He didn't know what he saw or why it mattered so much, but every instinct told him one truth. Whatever he had witnessed in that glowing chamber, whatever state that princess had been in, it carried a punishment far worse than he could imagine. And somewhere deep inside the citadel, she was probably being told the same thing, that a human soldier had seen her in her sacred form, and now the ancient law demanded only two possible fates, marriage or death. The cold stone beneath Elias felt like ice against his skin as he pushed himself upright in the dim cell. The wall shimmered faintly with blue veins of energy, pulsing like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him, and every pulse reminded him he was trapped in a place where humans were not meant to stand. Footsteps echoed outside the door, soft at first, then sharp and commanding, the kind of footsteps that carried authority and judgment. Elias steadied his breath, trying to prepare for whatever waited on the other side. But nothing could prepare him for the truth that was about to fall on him like a blade. The door slid open with a low hum and two guards stepped inside, their armor glowing with thin lines of power as they pulled him up with brutal hands. His ribs cried out, but he held in the sound because he didn't want to show fear. They dragged him down a narrow corridor lit by floating crystal lamps, each lamp flaring brighter when he passed beneath it as if it recognized he was an outsider, a mistake that should not be walking in this sacred place. The corridor opened into a grand hall filled with tall pillars of polished stone, alien symbols carved into them like ancient stories waiting to be spoken. In the center stood the high priestess, her long robes shimmering like liquid moonlight, her eyes sharp and unreadable as she studied Elias with a detached coldness that made his stomach twist. Beside her stood Princess Lyrana, her silver hair braided now, her skin covered in ceremonial robes that hid the sacred patterns he had seen before. Her hands trembled slightly as she faced him, not with anger but with fear. Fear not of him but for him. Elias felt a pain in his chest when her eyes met his. There was something fragile there, something like regret trapped under a law older than both of them. The high priestess raised her staff and the hall fell silent. A cold echo rolled through the chamber as she spoke in accented English, each word sharp and final. "You have seen what no outsider may witness," she said, her voice steady like a blade sliding across stone. "You viewed the princess in her sacred form, a state meant only for divine rights. This crime is punishable by death." Elias felt the air leave his lungs as the word struck him. He looked at Lyrana, hoping for some sign of misunderstanding, but her eyes lowered, tears gathering in the corners before she blinked them away. The high priestess continued, her tone unmoving. "There is only one path that can erase the shame brought upon the princess. The law of binding souls. You must accept union with her. A life bond that ties your existence to hers if you refuse. Your execution will happen before the sun sets." For a moment, Elias could only stare, stunned, his mind spinning as he tried to understand how a single moment had changed both their lives. He wasn't ready to die, but he couldn't force someone into marriage, not like this. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked. He managed a whisper. "I didn't mean to harm her. I didn't even know what I walked into." The high priestess didn't blink. "Intent does not cleanse the sacred," she replied. "The law stands." Lyrana stepped forward, her voice trembling like a fragile wind. "High priestess, may I speak to him alone?" The priestess hesitated but finally nodded, stepping back as the guards withdrew to the edges of the hall. Lyrana moved closer, her breath unsteady, her eyes shimmering with guilt. She looked at Elias with a softness that didn't match the harshness of the room around them, and for a moment it felt like only the two of them existed there. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this. You were hurt, lost, and I only wanted to help when I saw you fall from the sky. But the sacred chamber chooses its own time to open. I had no warning. I was not supposed to be seen by anyone." Elias swallowed hard, trying to keep his own fear steady. "I didn't know, I swear. I tried to leave before you even turned." "I know," she said, her hands twisting together anxiously. "But the law does not care if you die. The shame falls on me, and my punishment will follow you into the grave. I will die too." The words struck him harder than any guard ever could. It wasn't just his life at stake. Hers was tied to his in a way he never asked for but could not ignore. He felt anger rise not at her, but at a law built on fear, tradition, and control. He shook his head slowly, trying to breathe through the pounding in his chest. "So either I die, or we're forced into something neither of us asked for." Lyrana nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, "Yes, but I would rather bind my soul to a kind stranger than watch innocent blood spill because of me." Elias looked at her then, not as a princess, not as an alien, but as someone trapped just like him, someone carrying a burden she never chose. And in her trembling voice he heard courage fighting fear. She wasn't trying to trap him. She was trying to save them both before he could speak. The high priestess approached again, her voice cold as winter rain. "The sun lowers. The choice must be spoken. Elias felt his throat tighten as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons, watching him like predators waiting for a kill signal. Lyrana's hand lifted slightly, reaching toward him but not daring to touch. Her voice barely a breath. Please, choose life, choose survival. For both of us. In that moment, surrounded by ancient laws and glowing walls, Elias realized the truth of his situation. He wasn't only fighting for his own survival now, he was fighting for hers too. And in the silence that followed, he felt destiny closing in around them like tightening light, the kind that didn't break but forced two lives into one path that neither could escape. And as the last light of the alien sun filtered into the hall, Elias understood he had to make a choice that would change both their fates forever. The hall felt too quiet as Elias stood before the High Priestess, every breath heavy in his chest, the air thick with the weight of ancient laws and watching eyes. Lyrana stood only a few steps away from him, her hands trembling beneath her long sleeves as if her entire future was hanging by a single fragile thread. And in truth it was, because the moment Elias whispered his answer, everything changed in the room. He said he would accept the union, not out of desire, not out of duty, but because he refused to let innocent blood fall because of a moment neither of them chose. The High Priestess nodded slowly as if the decision pleased the gods carved into the walls, though her eyes showed no emotion, only cold tradition wrapped in silence. The guards released him from the glowing restraints and he felt the burning marks fade slowly from his wrists. Lyrana watched him with a soft ache in her gaze, a mix of gratitude, fear, and something he couldn't yet understand. She stepped closer as though drawn by something older than the laws themselves, her voice soft as drifting light. Thank you. You saved us both. Elias didn't know what to say. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to understand how his life had shifted in seconds. One moment a crash survivor, the next a man bound to a princess of another world. The High Priestess raised her staff high and the floor lit up with a glowing circle, patterns swirling like living rivers. The binding ceremony had to begin immediately before the law fell into dishonor. Elias stepped into the circle beside Lyrana, their shadows merging under the radiant light. Alien whispers echoed from the pillars as a crowd gathered beyond the hall, their faces filled with shock and outrage. Some whispered prayers, others whispered curses, all eyes focused on the human who had stepped into their oldest tradition. The High Priestess began the chant, ancient words flowing like wind across stone, as glowing vines of energy rose from the floor and wrapped softly around Elias's and Lyrana's arms. Lyrana's hands shook as the vines touched her skin. Elias felt a strange pull in his chest, a warmth mixed with pressure as the vines tightened around their wrists, binding them closer, their palms nearly touching. The air shimmered with a soft hum that vibrated through his bones. But before the ritual could seal, the chamber doors burst open with a roar of crashing metal. Armored figures rushed inside, their movements sharp and violent, their faces marked with black ceremonial paint that showed loyalty not to the crown, but to something far darker. The High Priestess shouted for the guards, but the attackers were faster. One of them lunged directly toward Elias with a blazing blade aimed at his heart. Instinct took over and Elias grabbed the weapon arm, twisting his body despite the pain in his ribs. The blade missed him by inches and scorched the floor with a flash of light. Another attacker moved toward Lyrana, her eyes widening in terror as she stumbled back. But Elias stepped between them without thinking, his body acting before his mind, pushing her behind him as the blade slashed across his shoulder, hot pain flaring like fire. Lyrana screamed his name, her voice breaking with fear. The High Priestess slammed her staff to the ground, sending a shockwave that threw half the attackers into the pillars, glowing light exploding across the hall. The ceremony circle flickered, the vines trembling violently as if unsure whether to continue or break apart. Guards rushed in from every corridor, clashing with the attackers in a storm of metal and glowing weapons. Elias staggered but held his ground, blood warm on his arm, eyes locked on the attackers who kept coming, their faces twisted with fury. One shouted something in their language, a word Elias didn't understand, but its meaning felt clear. They didn't want the bond to happen. They wanted him dead before it sealed. Lyrana stepped forward suddenly, energy swirling around her hands as a protective glow burst from her palms. She thrust the light outward with a trembling cry, and the force knocked the last attacker to the ground. The hall finally grew still with only the groans of wounded guards echoing off the walls. Elias stared at her in shock, not from fear, but from the raw strength she showed, strength wrapped in desperation. She turned to him with tears gathering at the edges of her bright lavender eyes, her hands shaking as they reached for him, not touching but wanting to. "You're hurt, I'm so sorry. This is happening because of me." Elias winced but shook his head, his voice rough but steady. "None of this is your fault. They came for both of us." The High Priestess approached with urgency, her voice sharp with hidden fear. "The extremists will not stop. They believe a human bound to our princess will break the ancient balance. This union threatens their power. We must finish the bond now." The glowing vines rose again, trembling, flickering, struggling to return to the pattern meant for the sacred rite. Lyrana stepped closer, her breath warm, her eyes deep with unspoken emotion. Elias felt the weight of destiny between them, as fragile as the light wrapping their wrists. The High Priestess raised her staff to seal the bond, but the chamber door shook again, distant shouts echoing through the halls, more extremists gathering, more danger coming. Elias looked at Lyrana and she looked at him, understanding passing silently between them. The ceremony was no longer just a ritual. It was a shield, a barrier, a powerful vow that could save their lives or paint bigger targets on their backs. The vines tightened around their wrists, glowing brighter, the light rising in spirals around them like a storm building in the air. Elias felt her hand brush his, soft and trembling, and in that brief touch he felt fear, courage, and something new rising between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Before the final seal of the bond could fall, a violent explosion shattered the far wall, sending flames and debris across the hall. The ceremony light broke apart, the binding unfinished, their lives hanging in the balance once again as shadows rushed in through the smoke. And Elias realized with a cold jolt that this union was more than forbidden. It was dangerous enough for an entire faction to kill for, and the night had only just begun. The explosion tore through the sacred hall like a beast made of fire. The shockwave slammed into Elias and Lyrana before they could even brace themselves, throwing them backward as dust and glowing shards rained from the shattered wall. Smoke rolled across the floor in thick waves as shadows poured through the breach, armored extremists emerging with weapons raised, their faces marked with the same black lines of defiance that had stained the first attackers, their voices rising in cruel triumph as they rushed forward to finish what they had started. Elias pulled himself up despite the heat burning his shoulder, his breath shaking as he grabbed a fallen guard's weapon, the blade humming with blue energy as he held it tightly, refusing to let fear control him now. Lyrana staggered beside him, her silver hair coated with dust, her eyes wide but glowing with a fierce determination that surprised even her. She lifted her hands as a faint aura of light gathered around her palms. Trembling but strong, the High Priestess shouted for the guards to form a circle, their weapons clashing with the attackers in a storm of sparks and flashing metal. Elias moved in front of Lyrana, blocking a strike aimed at her heart. The impact sent a painful tremor up his arm, but he forced himself to swing back, the blade slicing through the attacker's weapon with a burst of crackling energy. The extremists surged again, screaming words Elias couldn't understand but could feel in their tone. Pure hatred for him. Hatred for the bond that threatened their power. Hatred for a future they feared more than death. One of them shouted that the unclean must die before the sacred lines were broken forever. Lyrana flinched at the words, her breath trembling as she whispered, "They're not just trying to kill us. They're trying to erase everything my father hoped to build." Elias didn't have time to ask what she meant. Another attacker lunged. Elias blocked the strike and pushed him back, the heat in. His ribs sharp but familiar now, adrenaline carrying him forward. The High Priestess slammed her staff into the ground again, the impact creating a dome of shimmering energy that pushed back the attackers for a brief moment, her voice sharp with urgency. "We must leave now. The binding cannot continue here. Escape to the lower tunnels before they break through again." She pointed to a hidden passage behind a fallen pillar, a narrow stone path lit by faint blue symbols. Elias grabbed Lyrana's wrist gently but firmly, pulling her toward the tunnel as the guards held the extremist back with desperate strength. Lyrana hesitated, her eyes lingering on her collapsing home, the place she had grown up in, the place now burning around her. Elias squeezed her hand, his voice quiet but steady. "We can't stay. They'll kill us both." She nodded with a trembling breath and followed him into the tunnel, the darkness closing around them like a cold cloak, the only light coming from the glowing symbols guiding their steps, the echoes of battle fading behind them as they descended deeper into the hidden passages. The air grew cooler, the smell of smoke replaced by damp stone and distant echoes. Elias slowed when Lyrana's breath hitched. She leaned against the wall for a moment, her hand hovering near his wound, her voice soft but filled with guilt. "You're bleeding again. I shouldn't have let you fight alone." Elias managed a tired smile, the kind born from exhaustion and stubborn courage. "You saved me as much as I saved you. We survived because of both of us." Her gaze softened in the dim blue light, something unspoken passing between them before another distant boom shook the tunnel. Forcing them forward again, they followed the winding path until it opened into a vast underground cavern, the ceiling glittering with crystal veins that looked like a sky of frozen stars. A narrow stone bridge stretched across a deep chasm where glowing mist drifted lazily like living fog. Lyrana whispered that these tunnels were ancient, older than any kingdom, created by the first guardians of her people, but before she could explain more, distant footsteps echoed from behind them. They weren't alone in the tunnels. Elias grabbed her hand again and pulled her across the bridge, the air cold against their skin as they moved quickly, his injured shoulder throbbing with every step. Lyrana kept glancing back, the fear in her eyes sharpening each time she heard the footsteps grow louder. Once they reached the other side, she traced her fingers across an ancient marking on the wall. The stone responded with a soft glow, a hidden door sliding open to reveal the outside world. A dark forest filled with towering trees that swayed like silent giants under the violet night sky. They stepped into the forest as the hidden door sealed behind them, leaving only the whisper of wind and the distant hum of night creatures. Elias breathed in deeply, the cool air sharp in his lungs but calming after the smoke-filled chaos of the citadel. Lyrana touched the bark of a glowing tree, her fingers trembling as she whispered a quiet prayer for her people trapped behind walls of fire and war. Elias watched her with a heavy heart, realizing she wasn't just a princess. She was someone watching her entire world turn into a battlefield because of one moment she couldn't control. A distant horn echoed through the forest. Cold and sharp, the extremists were hunting them, not giving them even a breath of peace. Lyrana stepped closer to Elias, her voice barely a whisper. "They won't stop, not until we're dead or separated forever. The half-formed bond makes us both valuable targets." Elias nodded, gripping the weapon he still held, his voice calm but filled with iron. "Then we stay alive together, no matter what." She looked up at him, her lavender eyes glowing softly in the moonlight, her breath unsteady but filled with determination. And for the first time since the crash, Elias felt something new rising in the space between them. Trust, fragile but real. The forest wind carried another echo of the hunting horn. Closer now, sharper. Lyrana stepped to his side without hesitation, her voice quiet but steady. "We move, and we don't look back." Elias nodded as the darkness of the alien forest wrapped around them. Two fugitives bound by fate, running from death into a night filled with danger, mystery, and something far more powerful than either of them had expected. And as their footsteps vanished into the glowing mist, the world behind them erupted with the sound of pursuit. Their journey into the unknown truly beginning. The forest wrapped around them like a living maze as Elias and Lyrana continued deeper into the glowing wilderness, every breath cold, every shadow shifting as if watching them move. The night air carried whispers of distant creatures, and the soft hum of ancient energy hidden beneath the soil. Elias kept his blade ready, his injured shoulder burning with each movement, yet he pushed forward because slowing down meant death. Lyrana walked close beside him, her robes brushing against the glowing plants, her face pale with worry but her eyes strong. Each step she took filled with quiet determination that made Elias forget for a moment how much danger surrounded them. The hunting horns echoed again, closer now, sharp enough to vibrate the leaves. Lyrana's breath hitched as she turned her head back, the fear in her eyes tightening like a painful knot. Elias gently took her hand and pulled her forward, his voice soft but steady. "We're getting close to safety. Just a little more?" She nodded, but the anxiety in her chest didn't ease. She kept looking at the shadows between the trees, whispering ancient prayers under her breath. The forest seemed to listen, glowing slightly brighter as if guiding them forward after a long stretch of running. The trees finally parted to reveal the mouth of another tunnel, older and colder than the previous passage, its entrance carved with symbols that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat from a forgotten age. Lyrana slowed, her voice low with awe. "This place is not marked on any map. It's from the first age of my people. Only the royal bloodline knows its purpose." Elias studied the markings, feeling a strange pull from them, not threatening but mysterious, the kind of mystery that felt important. Lyrana touched one symbol lightly and the stone door slid open, revealing a massive hidden chamber filled with glowing pedestals, each holding old scrolls, Artifacts and crystal tablets, the air felt ancient, thick with wisdom and memories that didn't belong to the world above. Elias looked around carefully, sensing that this room was more than a hiding place. It was something sacred. Lyrana walked ahead, drawn to one of the large crystal tablets that stood in the center. Her fingers hovered over its glowing surface before she gently pressed the side of her hand to it. Suddenly, the entire tablet lit up, revealing swirling symbols and images that moved like living stories. Elias stepped closer and saw scenes unfold in glowing light. Ancient kings, alien warriors, humans standing beside them in a distant age. A powerful alliance long forgotten by both species. Lyrana gasped softly as the truth widened before her eyes. Humans were part of our ancient world. They once helped us build peace. But the extremists destroyed everything and changed the records to hide the truth, she whispered, tears forming in her eyes as she saw her own planet's history rewritten by betrayal. Elias felt a heavy chill run through him. The images showed humans and aliens working together, defending strange worlds, standing as equals. Then everything turned dark as shadows appeared on the crystal. Extremist ancestors burning scrolls, killing diplomats, destroying monuments that held the story of unity, replacing them with lies meant to create fear and division. Lyrana clenched her jaw, anger and sorrow mixing in her voice. My father believed these stories existed, but no one else listened. He tried to restore peace with humans, but the extremists corrupted the law, including the one used against you. Her eyes closed for a moment, the weight of betrayal pressing against her heart. Elias placed a hand gently on her shoulder, offering silent strength, but before she could say more, the chamber trembled lightly, dust falling from the ceiling, the sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel behind them. Elias tightened his grip on his weapon as Lyrana quickly wiped her tears and pulled him deeper into the chamber. They reached another set of tablets, and these held something different, something darker, lines of ancient text written in a warning tone. Lyrana's voice cracked as she read aloud, "The one who sees the sacred form of a princess is not cursed. It is a bond chosen by fate to unite two worlds again." She turned to Elias with shock in her eyes. The law was never meant to punish, it was meant to protect. The extremists twisted it so humans and my people could never stand together again. Elias felt everything inside him shift as the last words echoed through the chamber. They weren't running from a real law. They were running from a lie built by those who feared change. Lyrana placed her hand on another glowing stone, her voice trembling. The extremists want us dead because our bond threatens the lie they built their power on. Before Elias could respond, the chamber shook violently as a loud blast tore through the entrance, dust exploding into the air. The extremists had found them. Footsteps thundered down the tunnel, shouts filling the air, their weapons glowing like molten fire as they rushed closer. Elias grabbed Lyrana's hand and pulled her behind one of the tall pedestals, his heart pounding as the glow from the chamber lights reflected in her terrified eyes. He whispered, "We need a way out." Lyrana scanned the room desperately before noticing a faint line on the far wall, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. She ran to it and pressed her hand against the marking. The stone shifted slowly, revealing a hidden passage just wide enough for them to slip through. Elias motioned for her to go first, but she shook her head, her voice cracking. "I won't leave you, not now." He held her gaze for a moment, feeling something deep and unspoken connect between them. The extremists poured into the chamber, weapons raised, their voices filled with fury as they spotted Elias and Lyrana. Elias pushed Lyrana gently but firmly through the opening, ducking after her just as a volley of energy bolts struck the wall behind him. The hidden door sealed shut, leaving them in complete darkness except for Lyrana's trembling glow. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone, her voice breaking. "They won't stop. They'll chase us until one of us falls." Elias stepped close, his breath warm against the icy air. "Then we don't fall, we keep going. We fight with the truth we found." She lifted her eyes to his, glowing softly in the dark tunnel, the truth changing not just the world around them, but something deep inside both their hearts. And as they walked deeper into the silent darkness, the ancient tunnel seemed to whisper the same thing. Their bond was not a mistake, it was destiny, and destiny was only beginning to wake. The darkness inside the hidden tunnel felt alive as Elias and Lyrana pushed forward, their footsteps soft against the ancient stone, the air cold enough to sting their lungs with each breath they took. Yet something warm moved between them, a fragile thread of trust holding them together even as danger closed in from behind. Lyrana's faint glow cast soft light along the walls, revealing carvings that flowed like gentle rivers, stories of kings, warriors, and bonds between worlds that time had tried to bury. Elias listened to her quiet breaths, each one trembling slightly, each one filled with fear she was trying so hard to hide. The ground rumbled again, dust falling from the ceiling as distant voices echoed through the tunnel. The extremists were still searching, their fury pushing them deeper into the old caverns. Elias reached out to steady Lyrana when the tremor threw her off balance, their hands brushing for a moment, sparks of heat rising between their skin. She looked up at him with wide, shimmering eyes, her voice a fragile whisper. "We don't have much time. They know we found the truth. They'll destroy everything to keep it hidden." Elias nodded, tightening his jaw as he walked ahead, each step carrying the weight of a war he never asked for but now felt responsible for. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber filled with ancient columns spiraling upward like roots reaching for the sky. A crystal pool sat in the center, glowing with soft blue light that reflected across the walls like dancing stars. Lyrana approached the pool slowly, her breath catching as she recognized the symbols carved around its edge. "This is the Temple of Judgment's lower sanctuary," she whispered, awe trembling in her voice. "This is where the ancestors kept the truth safe, where visions were recorded by the first guardians." Elias looked at the pool uneasily. The glow felt alive, mysterious, both inviting and dangerous. He stepped closer as Lyrana knelt beside the water, her reflection shimmering like a ghost trapped between two worlds. She pressed her hand gently against the surface and the water responded with a soft hum, rippling outward in concentric rings that lit up the entire chamber. Images rose from the pool, swirling shapes of light forming visions of the past. Elias watched as scenes played out before his eyes, ancient humans standing beside her people, fighting together, rebuilding together, promising unity that had once changed galaxies. Lyrana's voice cracked as she whispered, "This is the truth my father tried to bring back. This is what the extremists feared. The unity that could break their control." Elias felt anger burning inside him, the kind born from witnessing injustice dressed as tradition. He clenched his fist, thinking of the lies, the corruption, the lives destroyed because someone wanted power more than peace. But the light suddenly darkened, shadows forming in the visions as the past twisted into betrayal. Extremists destroying temples, burning sacred texts, hunting the last humans who lived among them. Elias felt his stomach tighten as he watched the violence unfold. Lyrana looked away, her eyes filling with tears she couldn't hold back. They erased everyone who dared to remember. They even twisted the sacred bond into something fearful, something deadly. They turned destiny into a weapon. Elias reached out, placing his hand softly on her shoulder, warmth spreading beneath his palm. She leaned into his touch for a heartbeat, drawing strength from the only person who stood with her now. A sudden blast echoed through the tunnels. The extremists were closer, their footsteps thundered like approaching storms. Lyrana wiped her tears quickly and moved to the center of the chamber, her voice trembling but filled with courage. "We have one chance. We must show the truth to everyone. We must use the ancient vision stone." She pointed to a large crystal embedded in the floor, covered in layers of dust. Elias knelt beside her as she placed her hands on the stone, her palms glowing with sacred energy. The crystal responded weakly, flickering like a dying flame. "I need to channel my life force into it, but doing so will drain me," she whispered. Elias's heart tightened sharply, fear rising in his chest. "Lyrana, no, you can't. You'll collapse." Maybe worse, she looked at him with soft determination, her voice a delicate breath. "If we don't do this, our people will fall into the hands of darkness forever. I'm not afraid to give a part of myself to save them." Elias grabbed her hands gently, feeling her pulse flutter beneath his fingers. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice low and steady. She looked at him, confused. "But you're human. This stone shouldn't accept your energy." Elias shook his head, squeezing her hands. "It doesn't matter. We're bonded, even incomplete. Maybe that's enough." Her breath caught as she stared at him, something deep and emotional rising in her eyes, something powerful and unspoken. She nodded slowly, trusting him completely. Together they pressed their hands against the crystal. The chamber erupted with blinding light. Energy surged up their arms, burning and freezing at the same time. Elias gritted his teeth, his heart pounding violently as the stone pulled their life force into its core. Lyrana gasped, falling forward slightly. Elias held her up with his arm, refusing to let her slip, their breaths turning into short, trembling bursts as the stone ignited like a rising sun, sending a pillar of light through the ceiling and far into the world above. The truth was being revealed. every lie stripped away in a storm of glowing visions that would echo across the kingdom. But the moment the light burst outward, the chamber shook violently. Stones cracking, dust falling in heavy clouds. Footsteps thundered toward them. The extremists had reached the sanctuary. Elias pulled Lyrana close as she collapsed weakly against him, her breath shallow, her body trembling from the strain. He held her tight, whispering her name with a fear he had never felt before. She lifted a weak hand to his cheek, her touch soft as fading light. "Elias, stay with me. Don't let them take you," she murmured. He pressed her closer, eyes sharp with fire as shadows rushed into the chamber with raised weapons. The truth had been released, but the battle for their lives, for their future, was only just beginning. The chamber shook as the extremists rushed in, their weapons glowing like angry stars. Shadows twisting across the broken stone as Elias pulled Lyrana into his arms, her breath shallow against his chest, her body trembling from the energy she had poured into the ancient stone. The air was thick with dust and fear. But beneath it all, Elias felt something stronger rising in him, a fierce need to protect the fragile life trembling in his hold. He positioned himself between her and the attackers, gripping the weapon in his uninjured hand even though his legs shook beneath the weight of exhaustion and burning pain. The extremists charged with wild cries, their blades raised high, flames dancing along the metal as they swung for the kill. Elias met the first one head-on, blocking the strike with a sharp burst of sparks, the impact jolting through his ribs like lightning. He pushed back with every ounce of strength he had left, the blade slashing across the extremist's armor and sending him stumbling backward. Another attacker lunged in from the side, but Elias pivoted and slammed his shoulder into him, ignoring the shock of pain as the two collided against the stone floor. Lyrana's faint glow pulsed weakly behind him, like a dying star struggling to stay alive. Suddenly the chamber filled with a rising hum, soft at first but growing into a powerful vibration that shook dust from the ceiling. Elias turned his head just enough to see the ancient vision stone still glowing fiercely, its light spilling upward like a beacon calling out to the entire kingdom. Through that light, the truth had spread across the land. Visions of unity, betrayal, lies, and the ancient bond between humans and aliens. The extremists froze for a brief moment, fear washing over their painted faces as reality shattered around them. The lies they had lived by now exposed for all to see. But fear quickly twisted into rage, and their leader stepped through the group, his armor darker than the others, his markings bold and jagged like scars across his skin. He carried a long spear made of burning crystal, the weapon humming with dangerous energy. His voice cracked through the air like thunder. "You have doomed us, princess. You have doomed our world by revealing the forbidden truth." Lyrana stirred weakly, her voice barely audible. "I revealed what you hid. Your lies cannot survive the light." The leader snarled and rushed forward, driving the burning spear toward Elias with deadly force. Elias stepped forward without hesitation, blocking the strike with his blade. The clash sending a surge of heat up his arm, he pushed the leader back with pure will, their weapons sparking as they clashed again and again, each blow heavier than the last. Blood ran down Elias's arm, soaking into the fabric. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, because behind him was Lyrana, the woman whose voice had become hope in his darkest moments, the woman bound to him by fate and courage, the woman he refused to let die. The extremist leader swung the spear with brutal strength, catching Elias's blade and tearing it from his grasp. The weapon flew across the chamber, skidding across the stone with a sharp metallic ring. The leader raised his spear for the final strike, his eyes burning with triumph. But before the blow could fall, a sudden burst of light erupted behind Elias. Warm and blinding, the leader stumbled back, shielded his eyes, and Lyrana rose slowly from the ground, her body trembling but surrounded by a soft, sacred glow, her eyes bright with the power of the vision stone still echoing in her veins. She lifted her hand, light blossoming from her palm like a flower made of fire, her voice steady despite her weakness. "You will not touch him." The blast shot forward with a roar that shook the chamber, hitting the leader square in the chest and throwing him across the room. He crashed into a pillar, the impact sending cracks racing through the stone. The extremists faltered, fear rising in their eyes as they watched the princess they thought they had broken stand tall beside the human they wanted dead. Elias moved to her side instantly, steadying her as her knees threatened to buckle again. The chamber doors burst open as royal guards flooded in, their heavy armor gleaming beneath the sacred light still spilling from the ceiling. Behind them strode King Thalion, his presence commanding, his crown glowing with soft energy, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. The extremists surrounded, the ancient truth still swirling in the air like ghosts awakened after centuries of silence. He approached Elias and Lorana, his steps shaking with emotion he struggled to contain. Lorana tried to stand straighter but nearly fell. Elias tightened his hold around her waist, keeping her steady as she whispered, "Father, the truth is out. They can't hide it anymore." The king's voice trembled as he placed a gentle hand on her head. "You have done more for our people than any ruler in 1,000 years, my daughter." He turned to Elias then, studying the human who now stood wounded but unbroken. "And you risked your life not once but many times to protect her. No tradition, no ancient law can deny the bond you two share." The extremists were dragged away as the chamber began to settle, the broken stones humming softly as the ancient energy faded into calm silence. Elias helped Lorana to her feet, their hands still linked. Neither willing to let go, she looked up at him, her lavender eyes soft with gratitude and something deeper, something that no law could force, something that had grown between danger, truth, and shared destiny. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Elias, I don't fear the bond anymore, I fear losing you." His breath caught at her words, emotions rising like a slow tide inside him. He lifted her hand and held it close. "You won't lose me," he whispered, steady and sure. "Not now. Not ever." The king raised his staff, the chamber glowing warmly as he declared the bond between them not a punishment, but a new beginning, a symbol of unity that would rebuild the bridge between two worlds. Outside the temple, the people gathered, watching the sky as the truth spread across it like dawn, breaking through darkness. And in the center of it all stood a human soldier and an alien princess, their lives forever bound by fate, courage, and a love that had risen from fear into something powerful enough to change a galaxy. Together they stepped forward into a new world, ready to rebuild what had been lost and write a future no extremist could ever erase.